Hi friends, I'm Shauna. Welcome to the channel and welcome to today's Friday chat video. I feel like we need a name for this series. We'll see. We have our coffee because it's a Friday chat. And in these videos, we talk about topics that I'm really passionate and interested about that are helping me and you live our best lives, but also kind of more like chatty and less formal. And I actually think I want to make this the permanent home of this video, or maybe facing my kitchen, like we're just having a conversation with a friend, because that's what I want this to be. Today's topic is one that hits super close to home within the contentment year, and that is the difference between contentment and happiness. I have somehow gotten to the end of July without being clear on what I mean by contentment and how I want to apply that to my life. That's not to say I haven't done any of that, because I have made some goals and, talked about application, even my own little slogan about being content with who I am, where I'm at, and what I have. In my own personal life, and when I see people talk about things on the internet, people have come to really use happiness and contentment in similar contexts. And it really made me wonder, what's the difference? Because I was seeing this rhetoric about people who want to live a happy life instead of a content life. And let me know if you've heard this as well. People who have a goal for themselves of, I want to be happy, or I just want to be happy, or the goal for my life is to be happy. I've seen so much of that and have heard so much about that throughout my life. And I'm over here thinking, did I make a mistake? Should I be having a happiness project instead of a contentment project? I was questioning myself. And so that is one of the reasons for this video, is to create this distinction in order to get clear on what contentment means to me, how I want to apply that to my life, so I can lead this intentional life and align my actions with my intentions and my values, and also see how other guiding principles might apply to my life as well, or maybe not. So I think that there are some valid criticisms of both contentment and happiness, and I can find this term that applies to my life, or I guess my version of the term, and apply it to my life. And hopefully having this distinction will help you decide how you want to live your life, if you're a happiness kind of person, if you're a contentment person, and also how you want to define the thing. Let's jump into the deep end, friends. I want to define these things first as much as I can. Happiness is an emotion, and it is also focused on pleasure and the pleasure of the self. And because it's an emotion, emotions are fleeting. Emotions don't last forever. And when we have an emotion that is so positive, like happiness, that is the high. We feel the high of happiness, which means that there will be a plateau, or there'll be a low, maybe not necessarily the lowest, but if you're so high, you will eventually come down from that high. Happiness is usually the result of achieving something good, desirable, or pleasurable. And when I've come to, research this meaning, the way that happiness is talked about is really associated with pleasure, and specifically pleasure of the self. Usually things that are surface level and not quite as meaningful, therefore the association with pleasure. And that's not to say that we shouldn't feel pleasure, or that we shouldn't desire pleasure for ourselves, or that it's a bad thing. But happiness to me is more like going to a restaurant and having a freaking amazing meal, or sipping coffee on your balcony on like a crisp fall day, and you have like the foliage, and it's just a really enjoyable, pleasurable experience. You can have happiness with somebody, or in the presence of somebody, having a night that makes you feel really happy, but the thing that made the happiness is usually more surface level, and not this internal valuation or connecting with super important or pivotal or core ideas about ourselves. The last thing about happiness is that it is an outward expression or a result of outward circumstances. Something like joy or contentment come from within. And both of those things require intentionality. Happiness can happen to you without you trying, or you can experience happiness without trying to be happy. That's certainly not all the time. Whereas something like joy or contentment, you almost always have to be intentional about creating that experience. And both of those things are more internal. Contentment, on the other hand, is a state of being and not an emotion. So you can theoretically be content for months, years, decades of your life. One of the central differences between contentment and happiness is that contentment can be a lasting experience. And it's something that can actually be sustained where happiness can't. Also attached to happiness is, I would say, a state of being satisfied. And I would add a satisfaction with who you are, where you are, and what you have. That you are enough, or that situation, that thing is enough. I think satisfaction probably is a better term. With contentment as well, I would say there's this application of making the most out of the life you've been given, and the person that you actually are. And so with that comes self-acceptance. I look this way. This is my body. This is my mind. This is my physical appearance, or these are the skills that I have. And I think this is where some of the maybe disconnect can happen. Accepting yourself for who you are as a person means accepting that you have flaws, or maybe that you're not the most intelligent or beautiful person, and you can't be that. And so there's this meeting yourself where you are and accepting you for who you are. And I think for some people, this can come across as maybe, and I think what might get people the wrong way about contentment is applying that mentality to circumstance. Like, I'll never have a job that is perfect, or I'll never have this that's perfect. I think contentment is less focused on the perfect and a lot more on self-accepting. And when you accept yourself, then I think you will lead a life that is more pleasurable, that is enjoyable to be your own person. And I think also with contentment, wanting to change something about yourself, like a bad habit, doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't, ruin you as a whole. Like, having this one thing you want to work on doesn't mean, like we throw the baby out with the bathwater, as they say. It's not a reflection on your entire being. And there's less focus on perfection. And I think this is entirely why we can see contentment as a long-term or sustained thing. Because if you accept yourself for who you are, then I think there's less comparison. And then there's this appreciation as well. I think that there's a more self-awareness of what you can change, or maybe should change, and what you can't. And wanting to change something as well doesn't mean that you can't be content or aren't content with where you're at. But I think having too much focus on that can create this cycle of never being happy or never being satisfied. And so people who are content, I think, have this balance. I want to get more into the comparisons now, and to get back to happiness, I think that the fact that it is this emotion that is based on pleasure and that experience, this fluctuation in life, that when you have a happy moment, you then come down from it. And I think this can create this constant need or desire or chase of the happiness. Like, you want to experience that again, and people can get stuck chasing it. And they can create this focus, or this singular focus, on finding the next thing to make them happy. And when you do that, that takes attention and time away from the present. In my opinion, you can't be present with yourself, with your life, your job, or the people around you if you're consistently looking for the next thing to make you happy. It's always looking for the future instead of being present in the now. That's not to say that people who are content don't enjoy or appreciate or attempt to have happiness, but when that's defocused and contentment is the focus, there's less of the chase and more of being in the moment and being aware and appreciating the moment and what's happening around you or with you, that creates, or I think contributes to, that longer lasting state. one of the things that I came to really appreciate is pleasure, and that pleasure has that dopamine hit. And I'm going to use an analogy that I think might really resonate with this community. I think we can compare this chase with consumption and shopping. When shopping feels good, and the reason why a lot of us shop beyond our means or in ways that aren't desirable for as long as we do, is because of the dopamine hit. It's the act of buying the thing opposed to using the thing or having the thing. And so we chase the next purchase, and we're always buying something to always have that dopamine hit. We just want more. There's never enough because we use this thing to get that dopamine hit. So there's never enough, and then we're chasing it. And also, I would say that when we buy things, we feel happy. The pursuit of happiness doesn't actually mean that we live happy lives, because we want to feel happy again now. And it's never enough. I think it becomes this constant chase because there's that come down from the high. And this is, I think, one of the ultimate dangers of happiness, is the constant chase that I think leaves us unfulfilled. And when we're looking or spending so much time focusing on this one thing, we negate everything else around us. We're focusing on other things. Or maybe if you're somebody who isn't singularly focused on happiness, but wants to live the happy life, then that becomes a part of your identity or your goals, and there is some chase in some respect. I personally don't want to live a life where I'm chasing the next dose of happiness. This is not to say that happiness serves no purpose in our lives or that we should avoid it. Happiness can be a useful metric for some things, like experiences that we do want to have pleasure in, or for me, something like my hobbies. I would say that my hobbies bring me happiness, and my pleasure in them is a really important part of me wanting to do them. It's also an important part of figuring out what might become a hobby, because you have to enjoy it to do it. And so how strong my pleasure level is matters in determining that. I think people who strive for happiness see it more like joy opposed to some of the realities that it is. I do want a joy-filled life. I do. But joy isn't quite that. And I will talk about joy more at the end. I want to talk about contentment now and the potential traps of contentment, because I feel like in the definition, I painted it as this thing that is just like, oh, it's so happy, rainbows and butterflies, and like, this is the thing, at least for me. When I compared the two, contentment really seemed like the thing that felt like what I would want to pursue. And, there's no downside. It's all a good rainbows and butterflies kind of thing. But that's not true. And the reason why I want to talk about potential downsides is to avoid potential traps for ourselves and to avoid experiencing the downsides if we can. I think that the trap here is settling and being comfortable in ways that are not positive. And by that, I mean living life within your comfort zones. Are you working a job that you're content with? Or you're in a relationship that's just okay, but content being something negative, content being something that is just okay or meh. And I do think that we use contentment in different ways. I think sometimes when people say, I'm content with my job, that isn't intended to convey something positive. But I also think that people who work jobs that they don't love and are just okay with are viewed negatively by other people. This is where happiness can become a little bit toxic. I'm of the opinion that toxic happiness suggests that we never settle, literally never ever, period. That reminding ourselves to not settle, or even creating a distinction about what settling means, would be important. Sometimes it's unavoidable. I think it's kind of an inflexible and rigid rule, but also one that has kind of been warped and twisted a little bit to mean that you never give in, period. That you never give in and you never compromise. And I just don't think that that's true. Let's say I'm looking for a job. I would rather have a job that's just okay than no job. Getting that job is not an act of settling. What becomes the settling is when you intend for this job to temporary until you find what you're really looking for. A few months pass, maybe a year passes, maybe a couple years pass, and you don't resume your search. That's when it becomes settling to me. When people talk about settling, I feel like it's most often applied to relationships. If you believe that you don't give in ever on anything, that can be hard in a relationship, and I don't think that's something that I want to ascribe to, because our partners, just like ourselves, aren't perfect, and I believe that there's give and take in a relationship, and that's normal and okay and not settling. I just want to talk about a little bit more about settling to give you a definition or an experience that really resonated with me to help me figure out what settling looks like, so I can understand in my search or quest for contentment, am I settling, and if I'm just compromising. Here's a quote that I think really encapsulates settling. Settling means letting go of things that are important to who you are, what you believe in, and how you like to be treated and loved. We settle when we start compromising ourselves and our own needs. Settling is about giving up things that are integral to your being, to your personhood, to your values. What would not be settling to me would be living with somebody who's a little bit messy and having to adjust expectations, or having to be a little bit cleaner and adjust expectations that way. What would be settling for me is if I am an affectionate person and the way that I know that I'm being loved is if somebody touches me or holds me, and I'm with somebody who doesn't and is unwilling to do that for me, that would probably feel like settling to me. The author goes on to say this about settling, and I really, really love this. I started settling when I realized I wasn't being treated the way I wanted to be, but more importantly, I allowed it, the action of settling, wondering what I could do to change myself so that she would treat me differently. I owned someone else's ambivalence and insecurities. I put up with her judgment. I settled until I realized it wasn't a safe space. The relationship wasn't promoting my growth or stretching my heart. It didn't match my definition of love. It was making me criticize myself and question my ability to create a safe space for someone else. When it comes to settling, we often settle in increments, and maybe not necessarily all at once, until we realize that, oh shit, this is not what I actually want. And I do think that sometimes we can conflate settling with compromise. And so if you're in search of contentment, what I think could be an interesting distinction for you to think about, are you settling? Is this settling for you? Critics of contentment argue that having contentment as a goal means that you are setting your bar too low or your standards too low, that you don't set your bar high enough to give yourself goals to strive for that push you. Relatedly, that if you're striving for contentment, you leave room for habits, mindset, and or actions that keep us small, which is a really powerful thing to consider. Are you lowering your standards or settling in ways that take from your power or keep you acting small? It could be something as simple as, are you satisfied with running 5K when you could be running 10K? I think that's a legitimate critique. For me, I do this. I do play small and keep goals lower than I am capable of achieving. But that often comes down to not believing in myself opposed to contentment. But where contentment does play in is accepting that as the status quo, as accepting that behavior as okay. However, I also don't believe that we need to strive 100% of the time to reach these colossal goals. Some people want to live their lives living and dreaming the absolute biggest, boldest, loudest that they can. There is nothing wrong with that. Some people want to create the next Tesla or Amazon. I say that not necessarily as like a good or bad thing, but somebody dreaming of these things to be as big, bold, and as successful as they can. However, with that comes sacrifices. The people who dream big in their careers might not have the free time, social time, or downtime that they want. They might not have a family or friend life at all, or one that is pleasing or serving them. The same can be said for people who have little goals for themselves. Or I think another example could be the opposite of the first one that I mentioned. Somebody who works a job that they don't really love so they can have a family situation that they do love. Somebody who is not dreaming big, bold in their career, but has really big, bold dreams for their family. And I do think that often when people talk about like happiness or dreaming or those kinds of things, it's often applied to career and not family. And I mean, I've been taught this as well, that having a family, or especially for women, that if you're not working and you are a stay-at-home mom, that like you're settling and you're less than, and like how can you really be living a life that you love? I'm not here to espouse that belief or judge you or to articulate that that is settling in the slightest. I'm here to say that people dream in different ways. And some people who never dream big will never have that experience of crushing a colossal milestone, but that is absolutely okay with them. I personally would never want to be with somebody who has the Amazon type goals for themselves, because that means that that person who is that ambitious puts the ambition first over everything. They make time for their dreams the most, and everything else is second. I'm not cool with that. I don't necessarily need to be somebody's priority all the time, every second of the day. There are people who are married to their job instead of their partner, or give their job more time than their partner. And that's not something that I want for myself. Now, to come back to reality here, where I think this applies is, can you be doing more? Are you making excuses? Or have you really articulated your priorities to yourself? Do you really not have time to run 2 days a week? Or is something else more important than that? I think that there are some people out there who will get up at 6 a.m. if that's the only time that they can run to make it happen for themselves. They value grit, and what makes them live a life that brings them happiness or contentment is that exercise, is that movement for themselves. So they will get up at 6 a.m. And I think universally we applaud this person, like, damn, you're killing it, which they are, but they're prioritizing running. But that doesn't mean that you also have to prioritize the 6 a.m. run. Sleep might literally be way more important to you. And I don't mean that in a jokey way. I mean that in you have a different set of priorities way. So I think we would view one person as striving, as goal setting, as living a life that makes them content or happy. And the latter is somebody who is settling, who's not pushing themselves, who doesn't have drive or ambition, and are just like ultimately settling in their life. Now, I was talking about the pitfalls of contentment, setting your bar too low. I think that the same can be true in the opposite circumstance for happiness. Happiness can set the bar so high we are never satisfied. I think that our goals and desires for ourselves don't have to be perfect. And being aware that you can set goals too low or too high is just something to be aware of. Having low expectations for yourself can keep yourself small, but having ones that are too big can keep you in this hamster wheel trying to find the next thing. What I do want to say or end with is that happiness and contentment can be applied together, and doing so can actually be useful. We don't have to live lives where we're chasing one thing exclusively. We can have values for ourselves that intersect or balance out other ones. What I mean by that is that if you're just focusing on contentment, that could potentially be a life which is blinders, or the same with happiness. But having multiple as the metric, sometimes we can go to one thing over the other, or if we're not finding the answer, or if we're just not sure, does this bring me contentment? We can look to the other values to see if it's serving us. If we go back to the job, for example, we might be looking for a job that brings us contentment, or even feel like it does, but then realize months later that it doesn't actually align with what you're looking for or what you want. Or how you experience contentment in other areas of your life. That's when you bring in reinforcements. For me, one of the goalposts or metrics I use if something brings me contentment, not all the time or everywhere across the board, but it's fulfillment. If I say I'm content with my job, but it's not fulfilling to me, then that job is ultimately not one that brings me contentment, because fulfilling is a metric in many circumstances of whether something brings me contentment or not. For those of you who are the happiness seekers out there, I was mentioning joy, and I think that that could be the answer for a lot of people to kind of put in the mix, if you will. I think that striving for joy instead of happiness is something that I personally would want to do. So I guess the question is, what's the difference? As I mentioned, happiness is about pleasure and is about the external. Joy comes from within. It comes from within your being. And while it's often described as like extreme happiness or pleasure, I think that's what it can feel like. But where it comes from is different than happiness. I think one of the greatest distinctions between the two is that joy happens when we experience things that connect to our deepest, most important, foundational identity, values, desires, those things that are like our core, the things that matter to us most. And we have an experience that connects with that. And I've also heard it described as something that makes life worth living in that moment. Another big distinction between happiness and joy is that happiness doesn't have the same purpose or intention or meaning as joy does. We can talk about joy at another time if you want to have this conversation about joy, but I think there's enough there to really create that distinction between happiness, and there's enough there for me to be able to say joy just feels like a more meaningful version of happiness, and one that can also be constant or more constant than happiness. What I really like about joy as well is that, like contentment, it can be there even when we're in the middle of difficulties. And let's say somebody in your life dies. I don't think there's anything that anybody would ever say is a good thing. We can still be content with our life, with our personhood and who we are. And because contentment isn't necessarily an emotion, we can still be content in other areas of our lives. I think joy can still happen when we're in difficult circumstances because of that. Maybe you're a really spiritual person, or maybe the death of that person connects you to a family member or a friend that you really needed. And what I can say, a recent example is that my brother and I were talking about our childhood and some absolute shitty AF trauma that happened. Well, maybe that experience of us talking was not, a traumatic one. Reliving and rethinking trauma can be an absolute fucking hellhole. But the fact that that was able to connect us and really trust that person, a genuine joyful experience that can bring tears to my eyes today. One of the most meaningful experiences I've ever had with my brother. And joy can happen even in the darkest of times. So for me, joy is a better metric than happiness. And this video has only made me more solidified in my belief about contentment, but it's also made me aware of the places where I could improve, where I could have a more content life, stop the things that stop the behaviors that keep me playing small. That's really meaningful to me. That's the video. I would really love to hear your thoughts on this, on joy, contentment, and happiness. If this video changed your perspective or solidified your perspective, and do you want any of these in the pursuit of your own life? I would love to hear about it. Thank you so much for watching, being here today. I would love it if you would subscribe if you want to see more content like this. I've also created a Friday chat playlist where I have all of these Friday chat videos where we talk about all of these really amazing in-depth topics. If you want to check it out, I do have a Buy Me a Coffee, a second channel, and an Etsy store if you want to check them out. And ultimately, hope you enjoyed the video and hope to see you again around here soon. Bye.